Hi, Dr. P here to talk about pre-firepower war games. Now this is something that interests me in particular, and it's separate from other kinds of war games because we're using melee, not firepower. If you recall that World War II games are probably as popular as all other historical war games put together, and that we have lots of firepower war games from, say, the Napoleonic era onward or even earlier, the pre-firepower war games are just a small segment of war games as a whole, but the circumstances are so different that I felt it was worth talking about here. First of all, pre-firepower means melee, but it also means poor command and control, both in battles and in wars, because the communication speed was also a great limitation. Sea communications were much faster than land communications, but still there were no radios, no signal flags, and in a battle there was next to no middle command hierarchy to communicate with. Moreover, many armies did not scout well if they scouted at all. The result was a commander mostly influenced the battle through his setup, which tended to be pretty standard, and through the units following him directly. So Alexander the Great won battles with his own companions and those accompanying. And even in the transition to firepower in the Napoleonic age and the previous 50 or 100 years, Napoleon was an artilleryman. He could personally command his most valuable force. Melee battles also were fraught with chance. The battle only would occur if both sides chose to fight. There are a few exceptions, like Hannibal ambushing the Romans at Lake Trasimene, but in general, it was too easy to set up on favorable terrain so the other side wouldn't attack, or to hole up behind walls or Roman fortified camps, and so battles were usually played out on a flat surface and both sides thought they had a chance to win. Keep in mind, armies often lived off the land, so the enemy couldn't threaten supply lines. And what else could you threaten? Well, cities, but then the defending army could hide behind the walls in the city. And it was very difficult to take cities by escalade, by assault. They generally were taken by siege. The commanders knew that the battles were full of chance, full of possible disaster. It could be as simple as some troops thinking their overall commander was dead, which nearly happened at the Battle of Hastings, where William the Conqueror was thought to be dead a couple of times because his horse was killed under him. Charlemagne, one of the great conquerors, won by way of planning and logistics. He rarely fought a pitched battle. Some say as few as 2 pitched battles in several decades. Yet he conquered the Avars, he conquered most of Italy, the Slavs, northern Spain. He was very successful without fighting pitched battles. And he didn't take chances by fighting pitched battles. Now, as I've said, a great characterization of these early battles was the lack of command control. I have not played the tabletop game Command and Colors, but I understand it reflects this combination of lack of control and chance. You have some influence in the setup, and after that, not much. The fantasy version of Warhammer seems to be the same sort of thing. But this lack of control is the opposite of what serious gamers want. So designers have to fudge in the direction of letting players control the flow. I designed a very simple Battle of Hastings game that just used cards. And I found that I had to modify it from what was the reality to give players more control over the process. Or it was not entirely random, but mostly random, how it played out. And that matches reality. But again, that's not what gamers want. Now, the big difference between firepower warfare and melee warfare is that when you have one-on-one battles among armored men, you don't have very many casualties until one side has broken. Then the casualties occurred during the pursuit. And of course that happened in early firepower battles as well. On the other hand, there's a lot we don't know about ancient battle techniques. The Romans set up in 3 lines and had gaps between their cohorts in each line, and we have no idea really how the Romans used those gaps. We have lots of speculation, but nobody knows. Nobody really knows how those melees proceeded. Ancient writers assumed that everyone knew those things, so they don't explain. We know even less about many Dark Age battles, although some historians don't mind inventing details. We don't even know the location of the Battle of Brunanburh, which occurred probably in 937, but could have been another year. And that was the second largest battle, perhaps the largest battle, we don't know, in Britain after Hastings. Melee battles are dominated most of the time by infantry. There were no stirrups on horses in ancient times, so you couldn't have the same kind of cavalry impact that you do with stirrups. In fact, cavalry didn't even exist until about 900 BC because the horses weren't big enough. Chariots could dominate the battlefield, but you had to have a certain kind of battlefield for chariots. And of course, there were not many horses available to armies in the Dark Ages because they were expensive. And Dark Ages, the armies were pretty cheap. I mean, armor was unusual. Swords were expensive. Only in the High Middle Ages did cavalry really dominate battlefields. And yet we can go back earlier to the Second Punic War between Carthage and Rome, and Hannibal's methods were to hold the line with his infantry, have his cavalry defeat the enemy cavalry, and then come back behind the enemy infantry, which is how Hannibal lost his last battle against the Romans at Zama. The cavalry had gone over to the Roman side earlier. What about missiles? I think people tend to overestimate the effect of missiles in ancient battles, with a few exceptions. The skirmishers tended to fight each other, and then they got out of the way for the real battle. Their weapons weren't good enough to affect men with shields and decent armor. The major exception is steppe barbarian composite bows and Byzantine horse archers, and another exception, which is relatively for brief time, is English longbows and heavy crossbows. And of course, a problem with missiles is that ammo is limited. Slingers can just sling any old stone, but sling stones really had little effect on well-equipped targets. So when do we change? The change seems to occur when missile weapons, I should say, were in the hands of all units, of all troops. Even after gunpowder became important in battles and artillery became important, you had cases where most of the troops did not have firepower weapons. They still had pikes, swords, that sort of thing. And of course, when you're using gunpowder, then ammo becomes a big supply problem. So there was a transition. And the transition, I would say, was completed when artillery became mobile during a battle and began to dominate proceedings, which is Napoleon's time, or perhaps a bit earlier. Now, in this pre-gunpowder, pre-firepower, I should say, period, there were rarely standing armies or fleets. They cost too much. The only time they didn't cost too much is national armies, which was even more rare. When there were standing armies, they were often mercenaries. The medieval levy, the fyrd, was only an adjunct to the king's companions, so you could call the king's companions or housecarls a small standing army, but very small compared to the numbers of people available. and only those small groups had military training and military experience in general. Even more rare is national armies or fleets. National armies as in conscripted for a long period. The Greeks did that, the Romans did that, and look how well they did. They had well-trained people, they had well-equipped people. The Greeks couldn't always call them up for very long periods, but the Romans could. But of course they kept calling them up every damn year. Did the Assyrians conscript? We don't know, but they had a more or less standing army. On the sea, warships in the ancient Mediterranean were not very seaworthy, but they were purpose-built warships. And we get into the medieval times, you don't have very many purpose-built warships. And fleets needed local bases. And it was hard to find another fleet in order to fight, so there were very few naval battles. The coastal terrain was often important in avoiding a fight or forcing a battle. The communications were very slow. The weather made a big difference. So we don't have very many naval battles to talk about in the pre-firepower age, more because of communications and because of limitations in the ships than because it was pre-firepower. Again, keep in mind, World War II era war games are about as popular as all other historical war games put together. This is all very different from more modern eras of firepower and fast communication.